Welcome to Micro-Digressions. This is Spencer Case, and I'm here again with Michael Humer, and we're going to continue our discussion of his self-published book, Progressive Myths. If you didn't listen to the last episode where we covered other material in this book, that's okay. This discussion is going to sort of stand on its own since we're going to be talking about different topics. So, Mike, tell us about some of the myths of feminism. Let's just launch right into that.
Yeah, so the feminists basically think that America is a sexist patriarchal society in which women are being oppressed. Okay, and so one of the big examples of this is the famous gender pay gap, according to which it's said that women get paid less than men for the same work. All right, so it used to be said, like back in the 1960s, they said women get paid 59 cents for every dollar that men earn. And then the number went up to 70 cents and then like 72 cents or something. And it's now the latest is up to 82 cents. And that's basically not really true. Other myths are like, women don't lie, or women hardly ever lie about rape or sexual assault. And then they quote statistics like only 2% of rape accusations are false or something like that.
Well, let's start with the pay gap stuff. So isn't this one of those things that has been just debunked many, many times, and it just keeps rising like a phoenix from the ashes, and people just keep on believing it anyway? Isn't it one of those things? Like Christina Hoff Sommers has been beating this dead horse for years, and yet people still have signs that say 77 cents on the dollar or whatever it is. So explain what's going on with those figures.
Yeah, so like this is not like a new thing that I discovered. Yeah, it's like I suspect that conservatives noticed this very early on, like decades ago. The slogan is something like equal pay for equal work, and then people quote the statistic. But the statistic is, in fact, not about equal work. It's about different work, right? So, in fact, almost all of the difference in pay is due to women doing different work, less work, or, doing things that get less pay, okay? So if you control for occupation, years of experience, hours worked, and things like that, then the 70, whatever it is, the 82 cents goes up to something like 99 or 97 cents, depending on what source you look at, right? And so, what it actually indicates is that men prioritize monetary income more than women do. And so they do the things that you have to do to get the money. And as a side point, I don't have data proving this, but as a side point, they're probably doing it largely to impress the women, trying to get rich so that they can impress women.
I've heard it said that men built civilization to impress their girlfriends.
Yeah, that could be. Right. And so the women don't need to make money to impress men. And so they are rationally prioritizing other aspects of their personal life. Having time to spend with your family and having work-life balance, so to speak, working in a more pleasant location or having more leisure time. And, these are all things that have value, and you have to give them up if you want to maximize your money income. And so it's not rational to do that if you don't love money that much, right?
I asked my students about this when we were having a discussion about feminism. We were discussing the Philippe Lemoine versus Rebecca Tuvel debate on feminism in Ethics, Left and Right. And you and I are also on that in that book on different issues. And I asked my students, all right, so let's just say right now I could give you a CEO job. You'd have a CEO salary. You'd be a millionaire, but you're going to be working 80 to 100 hours a week. You're going to have to go to board meetings. You're going to have to talk to shareholders. You're going to have to, if there's some kind of public relations scandal, you're going to have to address it. So who wants that job? And I think I had one of the classes. Nobody raised their hand. Nobody's like, yeah, I want that. Those are trade-offs I'm willing to make. And I think they're probably right not to want that. Like there are a few people whose personalities make them suitable for jobs like that. For most of us, that would not be great. Like, yes, you would have a really great vacation, once a year.
Yeah,
But
if they
yeah,
even leave you alone on your vacation, right? Because they might call you during the vacation because there's some problem. Yeah, so I don't want that job either, right? And as a matter of fact, I think it is unwise, right? It might be even the people who have that job. It might be unwise of them to do it. Um, so they might be sort of um, valuing money more than it's really good for them. And it's sort of like, oh, well, they want to have the high status position, but the status doesn't necessarily make you happier. Okay, so like the project of trying to equalize pay between the genders, like how would this work? Well, it could either work by convincing women to prioritize money more and thereby making their lives worse, okay, making the rest of their life worse apart from the money. Or maybe like we could convince companies to just pay women just for being women without having to do the unpleasant stuff, okay. Well, that's obviously unfair. Or like maybe it could work by convincing men to not do those things. Is that what we want? And that would perhaps improve the lives of the men, but also then who's going to run the companies? Like who's going to do the jobs that are not that fun?
yeah, and I think we should tell women to stop seeking high status men if men are not supposed to be seeking those kinds of positions.
We as a culture could try telling women not to seek high status men, but that's not going to happen, right? Like what's going to happen is a whole bunch of people are going to be saying, yeah, the status doesn't matter, but then they're still going to go out with a high status man themselves. They're going to tell other women not to do it, but they're going to do it themselves.
Sort of in the same way that people who are like anti-fat phobia, like there was this one woman, I forget who it was. It was like a Broadway actress who was telling, she was outraged at the fat phobia of the Brandon Fraser movie, The Whale, where he put on a huge fat suit. He was like this morbidly obese character. So from some woke quarters, that movie was getting criticized for fat phobia. And this person was like obviously a very slim Broadway actress, and her husband was a male model who was definitely not obese. It's like, yeah, the rest of us shouldn't see this kind of body as a bad thing. I'm
Yeah,
saying that I don't care, but then my
yeah,
my revealed preference suggests I don't want my body to look like this. I don't want my partner's body to look like this. But everybody, you should stop being so judgmental about somebody being 600 pounds.
yeah. I mean, that kind of makes you wonder if it's this sort of like intrasexual competition thing, right? Where like you want other people to be fat so that they're not competition for you, right? Yeah, this reminds me. Now I've forgotten where I heard this, but there's one of these podcasts I'm listening to where somebody was talking about how this sort of liberal intellectual elite women are saying how getting married and having a family isn't so important, and it's fine to have children out of wedlock. We should stop shaming people for that, whatever. But then if you ask them what they themselves want, they're like, oh, well, yeah, of course I want to get married. Of course I wouldn't have kids out of wedlock, but it's fine to do it, right? So,
This is what Charles Murray said in the book Coming Apart about
yeah,
the class divides among American whites. He says the white upper class in America, they don't preach what they practice. So they have like, they tend to marry at very high rates and have kids, but they tend to say like, oh, but you don't have to do that. Like it's not like especially good what we're doing. Yeah, so
yeah. I
I think that
mean,
might be where
yeah.
it comes from.
And it's completely consistent to hold that, well, it's just my personal preference, it's not objectively better. That's
That's true.
coherent, but
That's
but
true.
like if it's the preference of all the smart people who are succeeding in life, maybe it is objectively good, right?
Yeah, maybe that's evidence that there's something to it. One other point about the CEO pay stuff that I've always thought, which is who really has it better, the male CEO or his wife, who gets to live in the same house, gets all the benefits of his salary, but doesn't have to go to the board meetings, gets to go to the kids' soccer games, all of that. It's not like even when men have the high paying jobs, it's not like women aren't getting any of the benefit of those jobs. And in fact, in this case, it looks like women get more of the benefit of those jobs than the man does.
Yeah. I mean, when you said that, I was thinking, well, I know it depends on how good this guy is, like, because, she gets to live in the house, but then she has to have a CEO for a husband. Maybe that's not as fun as having a philosopher husband, for example.
Very true.
Because
Very true.
philosophers make great husbands.
Yeah,
As
I
we know.
agree. I agree. In my completely unbiased opinion, that seems totally correct.
Yeah.
This is just like a more general thing about feminism that you don't specifically hit on in your book, but it's relevant to some of the things that you bring up, which is it seems like there's just like, sure, women have some problems. Women have some problems that they face, but there's just such a like selection bias in terms of the data that they want to present. So I remember an argument I had with another student when I was at CU Boulder, where at the time this was something that was circulating on social media that women have fewer lines in movies, like men do all the speaking. So like this was something that was being complained about. I remember saying like, women live 5 years longer than men. 5 years. I would trade male characters having fewer lines in movies for another 5 years of life.
Yeah, you know what? I don't really care how many lines men get in movies. You know how many movies I've done? Zero. Like, how many movies has the median man done? So, like, why are we focusing on the job that, like, 1/1,000,000th of the population has, or whatever? Um, and
But I think it's supposed to be that you see someone from your group represented. Like I think the idea was supposed to be that women are kind of run down because they're not represented as having a voice to the extent that men do in movies. And that filters down into the psyche of ordinary women, even if they're not in Hollywood.
Yeah, I mean, is there any evidence for this? Like, this sounds like one of these just like made up guesses that there's no evidence for. It's like something that wouldn't replicate if you said you had a study. And like, what is the difference? Is it like a 5% difference or something? Because like, when I watch a movie, like, I haven't noticed this. I believe you that the men have more lines, but I haven't noticed it. So like, it's not a huge difference. So like, if I watch a movie and like 5% more of the lines are said by men, that's going to have like some psychological effect on me. I'm not sure about that.
I recall, it's been a while since I saw it, but I recall it was like a really big difference. It was like men have like twice as many words or something like that. And I got to thinking, I wonder if this is partly because a lot of movies are about war and it's men who fight the wars. So
Yeah. I was thinking, yeah, there's a bunch of action movies in which there's going to be a bunch of dudes fighting and stuff. So like, so like, I mean, I wonder if it's sort of skewed by like, there's a bunch of guy movies where most of the characters are guys. And so there's like almost all the dialogue is these guys.
I wonder if that's right. Yeah. So I guess if women want to start fighting the wars more, we could make more movies where they would have more war dialogue or something. I don't know, but
Yeah, although I think like I think men would like to have more female heroes doing the fighting, especially hot female heroes.
well, there's actually quite a bit of that, right? We've had like all these Tomb Raider movies and the Wonder Woman, where you've got yeah, seems like that.
But yeah, okay, yeah, but I mean, you're pointing out like there's advantages and disadvantages of being male and female. And sometimes it sounds like people are just interested in comparing like which is better overall, being male or being female. Okay, well, it's like you could find advantages or disadvantages of both, obviously, and like the biological things are probably irrelevant because it's not up to society. Okay, so yeah, big disadvantage of being female is that you have to worry about getting pregnant, and it's unpleasant and potentially dangerous. But that's not society's fault. So, most people like women more than they like men, and they're like that fits with my personal experience, but it's also come out of psychological studies, and this comes from both implicit and explicit measures. Right, the explicit measures you just ask people about what attitudes they have, and people report more positive attitudes about women. The implicit measures are these reaction time experiments where you see like if people can, how easily people form positive or negative associations with either sex. And it's easier for people to form positive associations with women as shown by reaction time. And so Like that seems like pretty significant, right? And that's like that's just sort of like an overall preference, right? And so given that, it's like it's the story that this is an oppressive patriarchy where we're constantly trying to disadvantage women is not so plausible.
I think David Benatar mentioned stuff like this, but I've definitely thought of this on my own. Like, if you saw a guy slap a woman, like in a restaurant or something, be like, call the police, that was an assault. If you saw a woman slap a man, I don't know what your reaction would be, but
Yeah.
I would kind of think, what did that asshole do?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I guess I would think it's, oh, well, not my business. Right. But I don't think I would call the police. I would think, yeah, maybe he deserved it. Maybe he didn't, but it's not my problem.
In either case, you wouldn't call the police if it was a man slapping a woman.
I think I would call the cops on the man. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wouldn't call the cops on the woman. Okay. Now you might think, oh, well, maybe there's a rational reason for this, which is that the man is in less danger. Right. Because, yeah, if your girlfriend is hitting you, oh, she's not going to seriously injure you, probably. And now, several years ago, like I had like two friends who had a disagreement, and one of them's male and the other one's female. They had a disagreement about domestic abuse and like whether it's more common for the males to abuse the females or vice versa. Okay, and the woman was like, well, obviously it's mostly men abusing women. And the guy was like, no, I wouldn't assume that. Just you can't assume that it's just on. And my initial reaction was like, oh yeah, obviously it's going to be the guys abusing the women. Okay, but then when I eventually looked it up, it turns out that that's not true. It turns out that it's about even, right? Which is weird, right? But
it's surprising because men do commit overall most of the violence in the world, like overwhelmingly.
Yeah. So 90% of the homicides are committed by men. But by the way, something like 80% of the victims are also men. So the feminist stereotype would lead you to think, oh, it must be mostly men killing women. No, men mostly like to kill other men, right? Which makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint, sort of. You want to eliminate the competition. You don't want to eliminate your mating opportunities. You want to eliminate the people who are competing with you.
Yeah, and you'd also expect domestic violence committed against men would be underreported, if anything was.
Yeah.
Like there seems something like unmasculine or shameful about admitting that your female partner is abusing you.
Yeah. That's right. Like, what kind of a man are you? So, you might think, oh, well, maybe it's even more skewed, right? Maybe there's a large majority, but I guess I don't think that. I think it's probably about even.
All things considered, like women bear obviously the burden of pregnancy, the burden of reproducing the species, and that used to be a much larger burden than it is now because death in childbirth used to be like very common. And there are certain other ways in which women are disadvantaged relative to men. I think they're more likely to be victims of sexual harassment and sexual assault and things like that, although not more likely to be murdered.
Yeah.
So when you add it all together, if you were doing like a John Rawls behind the veil of ignorance sort of thought experiment, where you could just choose, you got to just choose who you wanted to be. You choose to be a woman or choose to be a man, and you're thinking purely about self-interest. I think on balance, you're probably better off choosing to be a woman if we're talking Western countries in the 21st century.
Yeah.
What do you think?
This society probably, yeah. Now, in a lot of societies in history, it would have been the reverse, obviously. But and why? Well, yeah. So the risk of pregnancy is a serious downside. The risk of just being sexually harassed or sexually assaulted is a serious downside. But remember that men have the risk of being murdered, which is basically 4 times higher risk of being murdered or being assaulted by other men. By the way, the fact that it's being done by other men is irrelevant. It's true that it's the fault of men that men are being attacked, right? But it's still a disadvantage. David Benatar gives that as an example of sexism, right? That male criminals disproportionately select other males. The fact that the perpetrator is male doesn't mean that it's not sexism. It's just if the sex of the victim is part of why you targeted them, then that's sexism. And then just like the fact that people tend to like women more than they like men. I suspect that most people might not notice this. So, like, women might not notice that they're liked more than men because they're not really looking for that. They've never had the experience of living as a man, so they've never experienced what it's like when people like you a little bit less, right?
Now, would you say people like women a little bit more than, or somewhat more than they like men? Is that the average man versus the average woman, or are we comparing the groups here? Because it could be that the biggest assholes are men, and so if we're evaluating the groups, the raging male assholes are bringing down the group likability overall.
Yeah, well, so the psychology studies are just sort of asking about how you feel about the category, right? Not about any individual. So, like, there's not data to figure out why, like if it's just because there's a few assholes or not. Okay, but your question reminds me of the other thing I wanted to mention, which was men are overrepresented in extreme outcomes. So they're overrepresented in the quote best jobs in society, which, as we've discussed, are not necessarily really the best. They're overrepresented in the highest status jobs, but they're also overrepresented in the worst jobs. So if you're trying to figure out if you wanted to be born male or female, if like you are a disembodied, sexless soul, you have to take into account, okay, you got a greater chance of being the president or a senator or a CEO. You also have a greater chance of being a homeless person, a drug addict, being murdered. And then the least desirable jobs, like lumberjack is the most dangerous legal job. And it's something like over 90% or maybe 95% male. And that's true of most of the dangerous jobs, right? Which is why men suffer 90% of the workplace fatalities, right? So, and there's other crappy jobs like being a roofer, also very dangerous and not very fun. So just take that into account, right?
This is one of the selective presentations of facts that really drives me nuts. It's like, yes, men are more likely to be CEOs, and even if we grant that that really is, all things considered, a super desirable job, or more likely to be president or whatever, they're also much more likely to be overrepresented as a prisoner or a member of an undesirable profession or something like that. And I wonder if there is this sort of psychological effect of seeing yourself your group overrepresented in the highest status professions. Why wouldn't that be canceled out by the effect of also seeing your group overrepresented among gangsters, prisoners, etc.?
Yeah. It might well be. I mean, we're sort of like guessing this, right? Because like introspectively, I don't detect any effect. So the fact that the president is male, I don't notice this having any effect on me, like making me feel better or worse. Oh, he's male and I'm male, so I'm good. I don't really feel that. But anyway, but maybe there's some effect. But yeah, you would think like, God, every time you see like criminals who are in jail, when you see somebody being executed, it's almost always a man, or like you see people getting sent off to war, and so almost always the men who are getting shot at and so on. So I guess that should also have a psychological effect on me.
It's also hard to believe that most men are thinking, oh, Donald Trump is someone like me because he's also a man. Because like in every other respect, we don't have much in common.
Yeah. Although I gather, some people probably do think they have much in common with him, and they may be mistaken, right? But I gather that he has these like fanatical MAGA supporters who probably think that he's like them, and maybe because he kind of talks like them, right? Although he's a New York billionaire, so like, how much are they really alike?
Fair enough. Why don't we hit on the women don't lie about sexual assault kind of stuff?
Yeah. Do they lie or not? So there was this slogan, "Believe women," sometimes quoted as "Believe all women." Okay, and then like sometimes the feminists will say, "Nobody ever said believe all women," but I put in the book, I put the quote of somebody saying "Believe all women," and then there's like an article where this journalist writes, "Believe all women means believe women means believe women without exception," and then the article explains how no exceptions. This was apropos of accusations against Joe Biden, right, during the 2020 campaign, where he was accused of, now I've forgotten what exactly, but
The Tara Reid case. Yeah.
The Tara Reid case. Yeah, and so this, editor of Bustle magazine, which I think is like a women's magazine, was like, you got to believe all women, including when they accuse the people on your side, your political side. So obviously it's ridiculous to think, oh, women don't lie. Just like ever. Like, okay. Women are human beings. They're not angels. You're like, men lie, white people lie, black people lie. Just like every large group of people lies sometimes. Okay, but do they lie a lot, or is it only very rare? Okay. And then sometimes you hear quoted this statistic like between 2% and 10% of sexual assault accusations are false accusations. Only 2 to 10%. Okay, by the way, like even the 10% is a misquote, because the article that it's from quoted 10.9%, which if you're going to round it, rounds to 11, not 10. Now, not that the 1% makes a lot of difference, but that's just an illustration of how the people who are producing political propaganda, they're just like, they'll put every distortion they can in the direction that they want. When I heard that, I thought, how would they know that? So are they saying only 2 to 10% of the accusations are disputed? Are they saying that they got proof in like 90 to 98% of the cases? They got conclusive proof that it was true? How would they know? Like, what if there's a he said, she said dispute, and like there was no other witnesses, and the woman says this happened, the man denies it? How would the researchers know how often it was true? Okay, and then so I looked it up, and it turns out that, well, in fact, they didn't know. The 2 to 10% is the cases in which it was proven to be false, with some like really pretty conclusive evidence, right? Like typically the person admitted that they were lying. And it's 2 to 10% because there were different studies that got different results. And then it turns out that in a much larger range of cases, like 40 or 50% of the case or something like that, no conclusion was drawn. They're usually with police reports. They're usually looking at how many police reports of rape or sexual assault turned out to be false, meaning proven to be false. And then there'll just be some large percentage of cases in which the police just thought there wasn't enough evidence to proceed, so they didn't pursue the case further. That doesn't mean that it was false, but it doesn't mean that it was true either. But the people who are quoting the 2 to 10% are not including that. So they're not including any of the cases in which it was unclear and there wasn't enough evidence. So it's like they're treating those as all being true accusations, right?
Yeah. So in other words, the 2 to 10% is a floor, not the ceiling for what what's plausible here.
Yeah. Right. In the majority of cases, there's no proof of what happened. And so, the 2 to 10% people are just assuming that anytime it wasn't proven, it was true.
Isn't it David Lesak? Isn't that the name of the guy who's the main author of these studies that came up with that figure? He is apparently, according to the book, The Campus Rape Frenzy. I don't know if you've read that book a few years ago. But according to that book, this guy makes large amounts of money being called as a witness for like sexual assault prosecution cases. He gets compensation for that, and that compensation can be quite generous. Given that he does so much of this, it's like he has a definite interest in playing up the reliability of the witnesses, because he's called by their lawyers and gets paid for that.
I'm sure it would be hard for him to change his position. So like, I don't think that's why he adopted the position. I suspect it was more ideological, but it would be hard for him now to change it. And there's the financial motive, but there's also just like this ideological motive of people don't like to admit that they're wrong. So I don't really know what he would say about this point that he's treating unknown as true. Like, isn't that a problem? Okay. But anyway, by the way, there was he published this article, Lisak and a few other authors whose names I don't know. But so he published this article saying, 2 to 10%. But they looked at a bunch of different studies that had been done, and they only counted the ones that defined false accusation in the same way. Namely, false means proven to be false, right? Okay, so there's there's another study, famous study by Eugene Kanan, that found something like 40% false accusations. Okay, and like, which is
40%.
surprising.
That's
Yeah,
insane.
surprisingly high. And you're like, wow, okay. And in that case, like, all of the 40% were cases where the woman admitted that she had been lying. Okay, these were police reports. Now, I don't know why that rate is so much higher. So I don't know exactly like why 40% of the people were admitting that they lied in that study. And actually, his paper reports two different studies with different samples. So I don't know why it's 40% there, but in the other ones, it was like 2 to 10%. I'm suspecting it might have been that in the other studies, if there wasn't enough evidence, they didn't try to pursue it. And that in the Kanan study, they tried to definitely find out. Like, if it was sounding like there wasn't enough evidence, they tried to find out if she was actually lying.
So were these studies where there were actual criminal investigations? Because presumably the ones that would actually be pursued in terms of prosecution, there'd be more evidence for it, because prosecutors don't want to waste their time when they can't prove something beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yeah. Well, so these would be women who made a police report, and then they were interviewed by the police. And then if the police thought that it was false, then there wouldn't be a prosecution, of course. So the 40%, there was no prosecution because the police thought it was false, right? But Kanan's study, like, he doesn't label any of them as false unless they actually admitted that it was false, right? And you might think, wow, like, why would there be all these people making these false accusations? Okay, but if you think that if you're wondering that, you may not know enough about human beings. Like, you may have not had enough experience of human nature. Okay, so like, here's one of the stories. There was a woman whose husband was away overseas, and she was having an affair with someone while the husband was gone. And she became afraid that she'd gotten pregnant from her lover. And so she invented a story that she had been raped in order to explain why she would be pregnant without admitting that she was cheating. Okay, so, and like, if you're surprised that would happen, you haven't met enough humans, because that is a thing that human beings do.
I guess revenge after a breakup is another motive.
Yeah, there'd be things that there's another story where, okay, there's a woman who's living with her mother in a house, and then they had a boarder who was renting a room, and then so the young woman was having an affair with the boarder. And then when the mother found out about it, she kicked him out. Okay. And then the young woman went to him and said, okay, like, give me an hour and I can join you and leave with you. And he said, who the hell wants you? Okay. So then, he was an asshole. So then she got even with him by accusing him of rape. Right. And like, again, like, this is not a thing that, nice people that we would hang out with would do, but it's not surprising there are human beings like that.
Women seem to be much more successful in organizing around the issues that affect women. Like, women's rights is a mainstream kind of phrase, whereas men's rights is not. There's not a counterpart of the feminist movement for men. It isn't nearly as successful. It's sort of seen as like a fringe cause.
Yeah, there's a men's rights movement.
Yeah.
But it's much smaller and less reputable, you might say.
Right. And I wonder if you think that's because women are just naturally better able to organize. Like, men are more likely to be sort of loners. It's like herding cats, trying to get men together for a men's movement. I don't know. You think something like that's the reason, or is there another explanation I'm overlooking?
I mean, I've never thought that. I haven't noticed that particularly. So, yeah, there's a bunch of loner men, but there's also a bunch of men who are really into organizing groups and stuff, right? Like, look at the leaders of all these companies, right? And leaders of these countries and whatever, like leaders of gangs and stuff. But I suspect it's more like people have more sympathy for women's problems than for men's problems. And I suspect that's true of both men and women. And so, so if some dude starts complaining to you about their problems, your reaction might be, well, suck it up, dude, loser. And, if a woman starts complaining, then like our natural reaction is, oh, well, we need to solve that. Let's try to help them. Some people refer to the gamma bias. There's there are these, different biases about the sexes. And so the gamma bias is sort of emphasizing women's problems more. If there's a problem and a woman suffers it, then it's seen as a gendered problem. If there's a problem that men suffer, then it's just a general problem. And if a man did something good, they'll just say like a person did. Okay, so like, woman does a good thing, then the headline will be woman does such and such. But if a man does some good thing, the headline will be, a Londoner did such and such or whatever, because it was a person from London. And so, that's part of this. Like as an example, the form of cancer that gets the most research money is breast cancer. Like periodically, people have these events to raise money for breast cancer research, and why is that? Like, how about you ever see people doing events to raise money for prostate cancer research? No. How about lung cancer? Because that kills a lot of people. Colon cancer, that also kills a lot of people. Like, why are those less emphasized? Well, it's the cancer that almost entirely targets women that gets the attention.
Well, there's a lot more we could say about this, but I want to move on to other issues of sex and gender. So you've got some chapters in here about like gender and the transgender issues and this kind of thing I wanted to kind of get to. And I think I disagree with you more on some of these chapters. At least I'm not as confident that I agree. So like chapter 14, what is gender? I kind of had this reaction to it, which is you give an interesting account of what gender is. I think I wouldn't agree with you in your account, but it kind of feels like in most of these other chapters, it's like you're laying down facts. Like progressives say like 1,000 unarmed black men a year are killed by police, and it's like much less than that.
Like 30,
yeah, it's much less than that, and even then, it's like some of those are dubious circumstances. But then like this doesn't seem like a fact check. This is like, okay, here's my opinion of gender, and I don't know that it really fits well with the rest of the book. It kind of seems more like, yeah, that's one opinion. So I kind of had that reaction. Like I wasn't sure that it fit well with the rest of the material.
Yeah. So like the general approach of the book is here's a myth. Here's some people who say that, and then here's the actual facts that show that it's false. Now, in that chapter, the myth was, gender is a social construct, and I think there's really clear evidence that that's false, and evidence that even progressives would accept. Okay, but then I go off and say what I think gender is, and that's just like a theory. That's not like a proven fact or anything. It's my theory, and why is that there? Because even though it's not like a proven fact or anything, like I thought you kind of need some sense of what gender is to understand what's going on with the transgenderism phenomenon. We need some orientation. And if I'm saying like some of the people who say that they're transgender are not really, I feel like I need to tell you a theory to explain how that makes sense, or like what I even think that means.
All right, well, let's dive into your theory, your account of gender. You want to distinguish gender from sex. I think I get my own view is I just think we should keep gender as a purely grammatical term. I don't know that it has a useful application to humans, but you want to hang on to this distinction. And your account is actually pretty interesting, and I think it might be original. So why don't you tell us what that is?
Yeah. Well, so like the first short version is sex is in the body, gender is in the brain. The two sexes differ in many different respects, and they differ in like almost every organ in the body. Now, what actually defines your sex is the differences in the reproductive system. Okay, but there will be incidental differences all over the body. As an interesting just side point, like it turns out that male and female retinas are distinguishable. So you can train a computer to recognize male and female retinas, even though a human cannot tell the difference. So if you look at a picture of a male and female retina, you can't tell which is which, but a computer can be trained to do it. So, okay. And so it would be surprising if there weren't differences in the brain. In fact, there are differences in the brain. Now, a bunch of the differences in the brain are things that, most of them are things that wouldn't mean anything to a brain scientist. But it'll be like this area is thicker in one sex, and then this area has more of this kind of cell and less of the other kind of cell, or whatever. Okay, and so my thought is that, well, some of these are adaptive. So males and females face different situations, and like, what is adaptive behavior for if you're in a male body for promoting reproductive success is not necessarily the same as what's adaptive for a female. Okay, so my thought is there are psychological differences that are caused by genetics, right? They're caused by differences in the brain, which are genetically programmed and which are, adaptive. They're adaptations for life in a particular type of body. All right, so the masculine gender is a set of psychological traits that evolution designed to go with a male body to promote reproductive fitness if you're in a male body. And then the feminine gender is the traits that are adaptive if you're in a female body. And then it might just turn out sometimes something goes wrong and somehow you wind up with like a masculine brain in a female body or vice versa, right? Which is part of the transgender phenomenon.
So I want to ask a clarifying question, because it sounds like you've given me two different accounts here, which is one of them is it's an account in terms of the brain, and then another is account in terms of psychological traits, which are distinct, although you would expect there to be something in the brain to support those psychological traits. So suppose I had a very feminine, conforming kind of personality. I had all of those psychological traits. But you scan my brain, and my brain looks like a male brain. Would my gender be male or female on your account?
Well, I don't know. I don't think that we have to discuss that case because I don't think that that's real. So that is, I think psychological traits supervene on brain properties. Okay, so if there were robust psychological differences between you and other men, there would be differences in the brain. And if we didn't see them, it would just mean that we didn't have good enough technology for detecting them, right? Because like the brain is the cause of our mental states.
Sure. I agree. But what I mean is, if we had good enough technology and you looked at my brain and it looked very much like a male brain, would you say, well, you must just be wrong about your character traits and your preferences and your psychology and all that because we're looking at your brain and it's a male brain? Or would you say, oh, I guess a brain of this structure and type really can support a female gender identity?
I guess I put it like this, like your fundamental question might be, well, what's the fundamental thing? Is it the psychological or is it the physical? I guess I would say like the gender is the psychological traits, which are caused by properties of the brain, which are caused by our genes.
Okay, sure.
Well, actually, they're more directly caused by hormones that you're exposed to during development, but the hormones are normally caused by what gene sequence you have. So in theory, there could be a gender for, like, if there were angels or God or whatever, in theory, they could have a gender. Although there's no particular reason for God to have a gender if he exists. If they exist, I don't know. There's no particular reason because God doesn't have a biological sex, so there's no reason for God to have traits that would be adaptive if you had a biological sex and you were reproducing.
Well, if you were raised Mormon, you would see that God does have a biological sex. He's male.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Okay. But so I guess I want to hear more about these traits. So what about being attracted to men? Suppose somebody is like we're talking about a gay male. Surely the trait of being attracted to men is more typical of females and for evolutionary reasons, right? But it seems weird to think that that would count against you having your gender be man, at least if we're using gender as we ordinarily use it.
That doesn't strike me as weird, actually. I think that does count towards your having the other gender, but it's not dispositive because there's more to it, and there are other traits that are more strongly correlated. So if the only thing you have is that you're sexually attracted to men, like you're in a male body and you're sexually attracted to other males, that's the only thing, then you're just a gay dude. You're not a trans. But okay, what are the other traits? Well, there's like just feeling comfortable in a certain body type, right? Because traditionally, gender dysphoria was this just pretty strong discomfort that people would have with the characteristics of their body, the sexed characteristics. So like they would just feel like it was wrong that they had a penis and they would feel like they should have breasts or something like that. So, my thought is that, well, evolution is kind of like designed your brain to be expecting a certain kind of body. There's sort of like, two designs. There's like the design for if you're male or if you're female, and just like it gave you the brain that was meant for the other sex. So then you're expecting to have that kind of body, and then you feel this discomfort. And okay, so like I think that's a stronger indicator of your gender, and that's partly because like that is more strongly correlated with sex, right? Like this, I think maybe something like 5% of people are gay, and then the people who have this kind of body dysmorphia, according to the DSM, like in 2013, it was something like 1 in 30,000 or 1 in 100,000 or something like that.
The actual surveys put the percentage of the population that's gay like much lower than that. However, there is data from Google searches in the book, Everybody Lies, that like 5% of the population is like searching gay porn. It's funny, the author, was it Seth Steven Davidowitz? I think that's the name of the author. Even points out that there are searches where a lot of people are like searching, please tell me that enjoying watching gay porn doesn't make me gay. But it seems like it's some evidence that you are. Maybe you're just not ready to accept that about yourself. But it seems like if we're going to go with your psychological theory of gender, it seems like what we should, just this thing about, do you feel comfortable in what kind of body do you feel comfortable in, isn't just one weighted criteria among many. I mean, that seems like it's the whole ball game. So, for example, sure, if I am a gay man who is traditionally masculine in all sorts of other ways, then sure, your theory easily accounts for why my gender would be man. But suppose I'm a gay man who likes chick flicks and I'm more nurturing and I'm high in agreeableness and not as competitive as the stereotypical man is. But I definitely think of myself as a man, and I definitely think of myself as feeling comfortable in a male body. It seems like your theory would have to say that there's significant evidence that I'm just wrong about my gender. Whereas I think if we're going to go with a psychological theory of gender, I think we should just make, do I feel comfortable in this kind of a body? Like that seems like it's carrying all the weight here. What do you say?
Well, I do feel like that's the most important characteristic. I don't think it's the only thing. So there are some people who don't have that kind of discomfort but still consider themselves trans. Now, you could say that they're mistaken. Maybe they're just mistaken. But my thought is, well, so in fact, there may not be an objective fact about what your gender is. It might be like just a question of how we're going to draw boundaries, right? Because there could be degrees of masculinity and degrees of femininity. And so it could be that you got some of the traits that are meant for the other sex, but not all of them. And so then there might not be a fact about exactly how many you have to have in order to count as feminine or something. So it's just like you're at a position on a spectrum, but there's no fact about where we have to draw the line. Yeah, although I mean, that is weird. And then like there are people who are just like appear to be females, but are sort of like masculine, like we used to call them tom girls, right? And these days, these tom girls might be convinced to identify as males, but we never thought that before. Right? We just thought they were tom girls.
I thought they were called tomboys. I thought that was what they were called.
Yeah, both. Yeah, both terms. So it's weird that they could be tomboys or tom girls. Anyway, but I think like the sexual orientation is also a good indicator. So there's a large number of trans women, self-identified trans women, who consider themselves, or they call themselves lesbians. And it is surprising, right? So among women, like the percentage who are lesbian is small. I don't know what it is, but under 5%, let's say. But then among trans women, the percentage who are, quote, lesbian is huge, right? It's like a huge majority, I think. That's odd. Why would that be? And, well, maybe it's because these are just dudes. Like most men are sexually attracted to women. So you would expect, if these are men, you'd expect that most of them would be attracted to women. And then like you might wonder, so like why are they saying that they're women? Right. Basically, there's this phenomenon known as autogynephilia, where it's males who are sexually excited by the thought of themselves having a female body. And this isn't just stuff like that I made up. Like, this comes out of surveys in which, like, a large number, like I think a majority of trans women say that they have feelings like that. And so that could explain why they're trying to transition. Like, they want to be women because it's sexually exciting to them, but that's very different from actually being a woman. That, right? Because, like, that is not one of the characteristics of feminine gender, being sexually aroused by the thought of having a female body.
Is there autoandrophilia? I've never heard of that. I've never heard of women who are excited by the thought of themselves being men. Does that phenomenon also exist?
So I've not heard about that either. Now, whenever you say does such and such exist, well, I don't know. It's a big world, so there's probably a couple of people like that, right? But as far as I know, this is not a thing that people have found in studies. Now, I think there is a phenomenon of women, and especially like teenage women, thinking that they're really men, but for different when they're not, but for different reasons. It's not because of a sexual fetish. It's because of there's some influence from peer groups, and there's influence from the internet. So there's this kind of social contagion phenomenon. Like, somehow being trans has become cool. And then, like, there are these groups on the internet that sort of like try to encourage trans identification and attribute different kinds of psychological symptoms that are just like common teenage suffering to really being trans or something like that. Right. And so, and that has just like exploded in the last several years. And that's why there's a whole bunch of now, like, young people, especially young women, identifying as trans.
Yeah, it does look like the evidence is pretty clear that the transgender phenomenon isn't just one thing. Like, there are the autogynephiles, there are all of these different groups who have different reasons for wanting to transition. And I know, was it Lisa Littman who had that work come out a few years ago suggesting that rapid onset gender dysphoria was a thing that was affecting girls in particular, and there was all sorts of efforts to silence her and suppress her research from making out into the public.
Yeah. So Littman did this survey of parents of kids who had rapid onset gender dysphoria. So this is where they claim to have gender dysphoria. They think that they're the other sex or they're the other gender, but they never had any previous symptoms of it. So there'll be like a girl who was apparently a completely normally feminine girl up until puberty, and then one day she decided that she was transgender. So Littman just collected answers to questions about the experience of these parents. And it turns out that, like, this phenomenon runs in friend groups. So like a lot of these kids, before coming out as trans, they had a friend who came out as trans. There's one story where there was like a coach who came out as trans, and then like 4 girls who were all friends with each other, who all had that coach, came out as trans within 1 year. Like, the probability of that is, I don't know, like 1 in many millions. So, yeah.
What I have thought of with regard to this is a fact that seems highly relevant to this debate that I've never heard anyone discuss before. But have you heard of a book called Crazy Like Us by Ethan Waters?
No.
Okay. So this book came out like 15 years ago. It was really before the whole trans phenomenon really took off. This would have been before the time of the rapid onset gender dysphoria, or I think very early when this was happening. This book, which I read last year, and it was one of the best books I read last year. This book is by an anthropologist who looks at the cultural relativity of various mental health disorders. So depression, anorexia, bulimia, schizophrenia isn't so culturally relative, but its expressions differ a lot from culture to culture. And it turns out that there's very robust evidence, cultural ideas about what is normal and what is healthy have a huge impact on the kinds of symptoms people have and what kinds of culturally relative disorders exist, right? So there are certain very, very strange mental health conditions that exist only in particular cultures So, for instance, he mentions one in, I think, Indonesia, where men who have recently received some kind of slight or embarrassing insult or something like that get obsessed with the idea that their genitals are shrinking. Like, it seems very strange. And so there was this category in older textbooks of culturally bound mental health disorders. But further research suggests that they're all kind of culturally bound to a very significant extent, right? Like, to the extent that the last chapter discusses how in Japan, producers of antidepressant drugs had to like popularize the idea of depression so that there would be a demand for their product, and they had a concerted effort to do that.
Yeah.
The point I'm trying to make here is it turns out that there's a lot of evidence that almost all mental illnesses, and perhaps all of them, are strongly influenced by culture. And so it would be weird if gender dysphoria was an exception to that general rule. That this idea that it like, no, it's absolutely innate in every single person who has it, and culture has nothing to do with spreading its influence. But like anorexia, when people hear about the idea of anorexia or bulimia, there are more anorexics and more bulimics. And the evidence does not suggest that there's very much plausibility that we're just discovering more cases of what was already there. Like in Hong Kong, before the mid-90s, anorexia was very different, but it wasn't until Western, mental health experts started talking a lot about anorexia did this become a problem in Hong Kong. So why would we not think that something similar could happen with gender dysphoria?
Yeah. No, that seems right. So, I mean, I think there's a core set of cases that are basically biologically based. And so I don't know, like, medically why, but, just something goes wrong that causes the brain to develop in the opposite way from the body, roughly speaking. But then I think there's a bunch of cases that are influenced by society. And this is partly suggested by, the explosion of cases, right? So it used to be, gender dysphoria used to be affecting something like 1 in 30,000, maybe 1 in 100,000 people in the population. And then in recent surveys, it's up to like 1% or something like that. But so really, there's this explosion of 100-fold, maybe 1,000-fold, and you think like, what, that was just because society became more accepting of it? Like maybe there were always all these gender dysphorics and they just didn't want to admit it before. Like it seems like too much of an increase to be that. Also, though, it's particularly common among young people, and it's especially common among teenage girls. Like, and why is that significant? Well, they're also the demographic that's most susceptible to this anorexia, which we also just independently know is influenced by social factors. So it really does look like society is influencing this.
And young girls are just generally, it's not just anorexia, but other forms of social contagion.
Yeah. So like, this sort of thing is like unpopular among leftists, but not for any epistemic reasons. It's unpopular because like, it makes them unhappy. Right? Like, what's the actual evidence? And then, if you start saying, well, like some of the transgender people are actually just mistaken about their gender, then they're like, oh, why do you hate trans people? Right? So like their argument is not like a empirical argument based on the facts and evidence. Their argument is, oh, you're hurting people's feelings. Okay. But I think this is a bad argument. Besides that, that isn't a piece of evidence. Actually, like, I'm the one who cares about the welfare of these people. It's the trans activists who don't give a shit about the welfare of other people, because they want these people to transition regardless of whether they really are trans. They just like, the trans activists just want whatever. They want to give puberty blockers to these people who might not actually need them, right? It might actually be ruining people's lives.
You say here at the end of this chapter, and this is really wonderful, I think, people who lie to avoid causing offense are not your friends. They are selfish individuals who put their own emotional comfort and social status ahead of the good of others.
Yeah. Yeah, that's basically how I feel about the, like the trans activists who try to shut up everyone who's trying to expose what's happening, right? They're just being selfish.
The whole idea of the first person authority thing, I've noticed that, well, consider what these activists say about people who transition later in life. Like they were wrong about their gender for 45 years and now they can't be wrong. It
Right.
seems
Yeah.
weird to think that the infallibility would only kick in like post transition.
Yeah. I mean, and maybe the story is, well, maybe they always knew they were the other gender. They just didn't want to admit it because of social pressure. I don't know. But no, I think in some of the cases, the person will say they just discovered that they were really the other gender. That's kind of weird. It's like, what about the case of people who desist or detransition? Right. So like most of the cases of gender dysphoria resolve on their own. Right. Like there's disputes about all these things probably because of, politics, because of ideology. So like you can't get any clean statistics on anything, but it's most commonly people cite something like 80% of cases of gender dysphoria resolve on their own. So you can be mistaken about your gender. And this is like really important. Like if you have a kid who says that they're trans, if you don't do anything, 80% chance that they will later give that up and then they will come to accept their birth gender.
If you don't think that people can be wrong about their gender, that doesn't even take autobiographies and memoirs of trans people seriously. Like I listened to most of the audiobook of Chaz Bono's autobiography. Chaz Bono insists, I thought I was a lesbian, and then I later discovered I've really been trans. And it's just, you're not taking that person's autobiography seriously if you insist that, Chaz Bono knew they were transgender all along or something like that is your line. It just doesn't seem plausible. And if you're going to admit that people can be wrong about what their gender is, then they could be wrong once they're convinced that they're actually the gender that doesn't correspond to their sex. Like why would the fallibility only work in the one direction?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I suppose they would, maybe they would say, well, there's like a bias in favor of accepting the sex you were assigned at birth, right? And so then you take some work to overcome that bias. And like, I don't know, like if we were to imagine a smart trans activist or something, like a smart one wouldn't say it's impossible to be mistaken. Maybe they just say it's rare and, the person is in a better position than outside observers are to know their gender or something. But I didn't even think that's necessarily true. Like, if it's like a teenage girl who's saying she thinks she's a boy, expert psychologists might have more knowledge about whether she really is than she does. It's not that weird for teenagers to not know themselves.
Desistance. In the latest WPATH report, that the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, I think that's what that stands for, their 8th report came out last year. And if you read it, it is obviously political propaganda. Like it's just, you can tell by the kinds of language that they use that this was not a neutral, like objective scientific document. And one of the indicators of that is that there's no mention of desistance at all. It's not like they downplay it. It's not like they say that there's some smaller number than has previously been thought or something like that. There's no mention of it whatsoever. And then what they say about detransition is also, it's defined in a highly skewed way. They say detransition is like retransition. It's like you've transitioned and then you transition back. There's no failure of transition. Like by definition, that's like not conceptually allowed on the way they define it.
Maybe the idea is your gender can change. So first you were a man, then you were a woman, then you became a man again, and then you just got to go through the medical treatments, right? Now, in my conception of gender, that's conceivable, but there's not really any reason why that would happen. It seems more likely that it's people just being mistaken. Maybe the readers don't know this terminology. So desistance is where you say you have gender dysphoria and then later you come to accept the gender that corresponds to your sex. Detransitioning is where you actually went far enough to try to transition to living as the other sex. And then you later decide to go back to living as your birth sex. So it's more extreme, right? Because the desisters, they don't have to have actually made any kind of transition. They could have just said that they felt like the other sex and then later they didn't. Okay, so detransitioning is much rarer than desistance. And I don't know why. It might be because the people who actually transition are the people who had stronger dysphoria to begin with. Or it might be that transitioning itself makes you identify more with the new sex or the new gender or whatever. Okay. And, it might be that there's some cognitive dissonance thing going on where like you don't want to admit that you made a mistake or something. Yeah. But so what were we saying about that? Yeah. So, if somebody detransitions, I would say that's really strong evidence that they were mistaken about their gender.
So I wanted to press you on this. I want to get your reaction to this. So you say this on page 136. I guess you're talking about transgender people. You say whether or not such individuals are really men or really women is a semantic question. We could use the terms man and woman to describe a person's biological sex, or we could use them to describe a person's gender. So I had this thought about that, which is, no doubt you are familiar with Rebecca Tuvel's article in defense of transracialism, where she argues that we ought to support transgender identities. And there's an analogy between identifying as a different gender than the one that corresponds to your birth sex and identifying with a different race that corresponds to, I don't know what you would call it, race assigned at birth or something.
Yeah.
So in particular, there's this woman named Rachel Dolezal who identified as Black, although she did not have significant African ancestry. Although, like, culturally, she did quite a lot to make herself culturally Black, like in terms of like her clothing, her presentation. She had 2 husbands. I don't know if she's still married, both of whom were Black. She has 4 adopted siblings who are Black. Seems like she's got a very significant affinity for Black identity and culture. A lot of people make this distinction between sex and gender. What sex is either cultural or, in your case, it's a psychological thing, whereas sex is biological. And I'm wondering if we could make a similar sort of distinction about race. Like there could be a biological race, and then there could be like a cultural or psychological race that would be the counterpart of gender, but we don't have that concept for some reason. But I don't see any reason why we couldn't. We could call it, I don't know what we call it. So let's just call it psychological race. So Rachel Dolezal could then say, look, biologically, I'm not Black. I don't have African ancestry to a significant degree. Recent African ancestry.
Yes, right.
Because we all have African ancestry if you go back far enough. But I do have psychological Blackness. So whether or not I'm really Black is also just a semantic question, right? Because it's just which sense of Black are we going to choose to use here? Do you think there's an analogy there, or do you think it's different?
Sort of. I mean, if people wanted to start talking about psychological Blackness, that's fine with me. I think our current usage is such that it refers to a biological or quasi-biological category. So I think in current usage, it's determinate that she's not Black. Now, why would the usage not be determinate for sex? I don't know. I guess so. I mean, I kind of think there is a difference in that there are more robust psychological differences between males and females, which I think have a partly biological basis, than there are between Blacks and whites. And I don't know if there actually are psychological differences between Blacks and whites with the biological basis, other than just like our culture, right? So, like, the idea that you might have been born in the wrong body, like that's way more plausible for gender. It's totally bizarre to think that, oh no, like I got a Black brain in a white body.
Well, we both know people who would be willing to go to the mat defending that there are psychological race differences based in genetics and stuff. But I don't even think we need to go there. Like, as long as I have that psychological sense, why does it matter whether it's cultural or genetic, right? Like Rachel Dolezal feels that she is Black and she has a sense of what this means. Why does it matter that there aren't that many people like her?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's like, it's fine with me. I was not upset that she was acting black or whatever. And yeah, we should totally accept that. We should let people do that. And then it's okay with me if she says she's black. When somebody asks her.
So that too could be a semantic question.
Yeah, I mean, there's a sense in which everything could be a semantic question because we can use words however we want. I guess, I think our current usage doesn't recognize whatever it is, social black people as being black, but it's totally fine with me if we change our usage. I don't care about the racial categories anyway.
It seems like how we use our terms. There might be some ethical questions, like the pro-trans activists. They're going to say we should use our terms in the most inclusive way possible. But I think if we do that, there just might be some practical downsides. Like there might be just practical reasons to want to have women's spaces where women means female, not gender. I actually think there's the practical reasons for treating race as a kind of fixed thing that has to relate to ancestry are a lot less robust, which is strange that there was such a hostile reaction to Rebecca Tuvell's piece for pointing out that analogy.
Yeah. No, that was actually a good article. It's no, these are logical arguments, right? The arguments for accepting transgenderism kind of extend to transracialism, and that's not really a problem. We should just accept that. So, okay, but about practical reasons, in one sense, it doesn't matter if we say that the trans women are really women or not. We could just have two terms. There's biological woman and social woman or something or psychological woman or whatever. Okay, but there is this practical consideration, which is the psychological thing is harder to verify. So other people can know your biological sex pretty easily. And why does it matter? Well, say you have a criminal who's going to go to prison and he says, or they say that they want to go to the women's prison because they feel like a woman. Okay. Well, actually it matters if the person is just lying. If the person is lying, they should not go to the women's prison. And you're just to sort of dial up the stakes a little bit, maybe this is somebody who's been convicted of rape and he wants to go to the women's prison. And you're I wonder why. Okay. So we might have reason for just categorizing the prisoners by their sex just because we can't tell when the people are lying.
Why would it even matter whether this person is lying? This is a person with a male body who is a threat to women. I just think it comes down to sex. I don't see why what this person feels inside should matter at all here.
I mean, so in fact, what matters is what his purpose is. If his purpose for saying this is so that he can rape the women in the women's prison, then he should not go there. Yeah, but if his purpose is he actually is a woman inside, I don't know, man, maybe he should go. Okay, but but also probably if you're guilty of raping women, you shouldn't go into the women's prison anyway.
Seems right. Well, Mike, I think that those are all the questions I have about the sex and gender parts of your book. Do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, just everybody should buy the book on Amazon.
For a mere $12.50.
Yeah, it's a deal.
It is a deal.
Yeah, so, cheap at twice the price.
And Mike is going to get a huge portion of that $12.50 too. So there's that. He'll be
dollars and dollars.
You'll be giving him some deserved money. All right. Well, I think we'll come back again and resume the conversation. We'll talk about the tax chapters of your book next time. So I look forward to that.
All right. It was great talking to you.
Likewise.